Well, why don't we get started? If everybody can find a seat. My name is Rich Dandliker. I'm the Chief Strategist at Veza. And I came from the security and identity world, most recently from Okta, where I led the product management team for about 4.5 years through the IPO. I think identity companies like Okta have done a really fantastic job of advancing the industry, but it's clearly not enough. We see many organizations really starting down this road of trying to achieve least privilege, but it's a long road. And they often implement IGA as a path along that road. And that path is long, arduous, and exhausting. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about a new way, really focusing on IGA through managing authorization to data, and why I'm so optimistic about it that I really think it has the potential to transform the industry. You'll also hear from David Tyburski, the CISO of Wynn Resorts, about some of the strategies and tools that they're using at Wynn. So I love identity. We all love identity. That's why we're here. But I think we can all agree that although we've made a lot of advances in the last 20 years, there have been some great things. Active Directory, moving identity to the cloud, it's good, but it's just not enough. We need to go beyond that. We should be implementing SSO and MFA and passwordless authentication. Those are good things to do, but it's time to do more. It's really time for a second act in identity, and it's time to tackle the challenge of authorization. So I think we can also all agree that this idea of getting to the promised land of least privilege is something we want to do. We really want to reduce permissions, get them attached users to actions, and get them down to the level that everybody has what they need and no more. Right? We want our users to be productive. We want to enable them. But what I tend to hear is that organizations have a really hard time actually getting there operationally. If you look at identity teams or security engineering teams, compliance teams, they all need this to be able to do their jobs effectively, and yet there's a gap. So now if you drill down a little bit more and think about authorization to data, because that's really the fundamental part of identity that's most compelling and speaks to the typical executive team, you start to see that there are a lot of challenges there. When you look at the data that you need to pull together, it's typically separated out and siloed. It's in identity systems like Okta. It's in cloud-native IAM systems like AWS IAM or Azure RBAC. And then it's down at the service level itself. So it's really segmented. It's siloed and separated. And now you multiply out all the different permutations and combinations of these things. And you go from users to groups to roles to policies to systems, all the way down to granular RBAC level permissions. And you start to get a flavor for the complexity. And now, layer on top of that, that permissions are really in a different language. Every different system has its own way of expressing permissions and authorization. That makes it really hard. So now you get a sense of the overall complexity of the problem. And so if you look at then IGA system, which is a very frequent thing that a lot of organizations use to govern, to administer this type of thing, you start to get a sense of why it's not doing the job. And you look at these things, that what you need to string together, and IGA tools typically live in the world of users and groups, and maybe you get a downstream role. But they don't really go into the core permissions, the heart of permissions, and the core of authorization, and let alone getting into the individual data objects that you have in these systems that hold the data that you're trying to protect. They just don't do that. And you look a little more closely at IGA solutions, and now you actually see there's a host of things that are missing. We talked about this idea of really trying to manage just by naming conventions, by group names or role names. But what if your read-only group has write permissions in it? It's a lot of over-permissioning. If you go down to the system level and system-specific permissions, we talked about that. It's a different language. You really almost have to be an expert in each of those systems to understand what the heck all that stuff means. These IGA solutions don't help with that. Some of these security solutions might handle cloud platforms, or they might do SaaS apps, or they might do unstructured data. But how do you protect all the data that you've got wherever your data is used and stored? A lot of systems will take HR systems as a source of truth. But you've got contractors, you've got partners. What happens when someone who's not in your HR system gets access? Oftentimes you get the dreaded unresolved identity error. Integrations with your more legacy IGA systems are slow and costly. Oftentimes you need to get a team of developers that are specialists in that, or a fat SI contract to get it done. We've heard stories of organizations that have maybe 5 integrations with their IGA system in the first year. They give up, and they revert back to manual spreadsheets, right? Even though they own an IGA solution. And finally, most of these systems only really cover human identities. Machine identities, service accounts, oh, that's a PAM problem. So it's left to the PAM system or not covered at all. So you can really boil this down, this fundamental security goal that we're all trying to get to, as really being able to answer the question, who can and should take what action on what data? And this is a way to really express this identity-centric concept that we all understand, but in a way that's compelling for your executive team. So now, let's dive in a little more closely. Let's look at some use cases. So when do organizations in the real world actually get motivated to take action? Blackstone and Intuit wanted access review automation. So the key things for them was really being able to do this automatically without spreadsheets, to have easy integrations, and to be able to remediate, both for compliance and for security. Organizations like CrowdStrike and a Fortune 1000 bank had the use case of finding privileged access violations. One of the most useful capabilities in this use case is really the ability to do deep inspection, to get down to the level of local users, of ACL level permissions in that individual system, to really manage and fix over-permissioning issues that are found. Zoom and Robinhood needed to capture cloud IAM misconfigurations. So these systems, when you go into AWS IAM or Azure RBAC or Google Cloud IAM, are immensely complicated. Just as an example, the AWS IAM user guide, not the technical documentation, the user guide alone is over 1,200 pages long. It's really easy to miss something and just accumulate over-permissioning over time. Chime and LiveRamp had a need around finding structured and unstructured data access problems. So when you go into systems like Redshift or Snowflake or SharePoint Online, BigQuery, right? There's a lot of really confidential, sensitive information in those systems. They needed something to really apply least privilege. They understood that you can't just give blanket access to these things. It's too much. And so they needed tools that could actually manage the scale and complexity of these systems. Finally, Expedia and Meritage Homes had need around SaaS access governance, because every organization has hundreds of SaaS apps, each one with its own language of permissions. So you need something that can pull that all together and really understand where you've got issues. If you're also subject to compliance requirements, like for SOX or ISO, you've actually got to get to near real-time visibility of violations and get closer and closer, as close as you can, to continuous compliance. That's what they needed as well. So, what would a potential solution actually look like? The first thing that you need is to pull all this data together and really maintain the relationships, right? You can't just have a flat table. You've got to understand that, and a graph database is the obvious way to go here. So you've got to pull in data from your IAM system like Okta, your cloud provider like AWS and GCP, your SaaS apps like Salesforce, NetSuite, your data systems like SharePoint Online, Snowflake, your custom apps that you built yourself, on-prem apps. You need it all. You then need a way to pull it all together into a single platform so you can see it in a consistent way, and then tie it all together, maintaining those relationships. But it's really those connections, it's the paths that are really important that allow you to fix these instances of over-permissioning without breaking critical business processes. So once you've done that, now the first obvious thing is build some capabilities to actually let users see it. You want to visualize it, right? And again, the key here is not just getting who has access to what, but how do they get it? So when you can solve that kind of problem, you can answer questions like, hey, is this, did this violation come from individual permissions that were granted to a person? Was it through a service account? Were they local permissions? Or was the problem actually an entire group that was over-permissioned? Is the problem a role? Does someone have 10 different ways to access something they shouldn't, and you've got to correct all 10 of those paths in order to fix the problem? This kind of answer can help that. The second big thing is you want to make sure you can address some of the challenges with typical inline types of deployments, because it may seem like a good thing to actually put something in between the user and the data, but it actually introduces a lot of challenges that you have to be aware of. The first is really slow deployment, right? A lot of times, a big architectural change can introduce a lot of risk and really trigger a lot of internal reviews. It can take a lot of time. There's downtime risk, right? And when you're looking at larger organizations, heavily regulated companies, mission-critical, customer-facing applications, the risk goes up even more. You have an added point of failure just because you're putting another hop in that data chain. And last, a lot of these systems have a new policy framework, simplified policy framework. But the reality is, until you can transition and sunset all your existing policies, you're living in a more complex world. You've got all your old policies and you've got new policies. Fully transitioning away from your old policies often takes years. And so in that interim transition period, it's actually more complex. And it's hard to really get a handle on what's going on. So of course, visualization is only the first step. You've got to move on quickly to remediation. You've got to find things, but then be able to fix them. User access reviews is a very common way that most organizations pick as a pillar for this step. And then you want to move on to control. Once you really understand what the policies are and what they should be, obviously you want to get it to start there on day one. You want to start with those policies. So, but when you try and jump to control without really understanding what your policies are and what they should be, you're really jumping without knowing where you're going. And that's a problem. With that, I'd like to pass it over to the CISO of Wynn Resorts, who will tell us a little bit more about their identity journey, some of the approaches they've taken, and some of the tools that have helped them get there. I'm pleased to introduce David Tyburski.
Thank you. So I was sitting here listening, and your slide where you had your five, which was way back, your 5 use cases. I just was show of hands, how many people here have all of them? Because I do. It was every use case he said. I was like, that was where we are right here. Access review automation, privilege access violations, all of that. So we started this journey many years ago trying to understand 400 plus applications, 15,000 employees, some of them in the cloud, some of them on premise, some of them custom, some of them not. And how do we understand the journey of that, of all of our identity and user? So one of the things we identified very early on was the lack of an orchestration platform, meaning how do you get from a request to approval to delivery? Just that simple. There's nothing really out there in the market that we found that worked within our organization, so we ended up building a custom solution. And that custom solution gave us some interesting understanding of how our users will ask for what they need. So you go into your attestation process, which I laughed a little bit when you said it, because we were at a thing last week where everybody said during the attestation process, the answer was, everybody just needs everything. Why are you asking me, right? And that's where, unfortunately, that's where we get, is that the people who want to help control and to get you to that least privilege, to get you there, don't understand it. They're business owners, they're trying to get their jobs done, trying to do what it is that they need to do to move the business forward. So that identity management thing, yeah, that's just kind of separate. So building the tool set, building it to be easy, building it to be usable and understandable became critically important. And I think that's what we've done. We've turned that around as far as an attestation process one, flipping it on its head, and we call that a matrix process, to where we get the person out of the mix and look at it by position. and ask those business owners, these positions, what should they have access to? And we use that as a control mechanism, and then turn that around in the attestation process to say, how many people have violated that matrix, right? As opposed to who had the right access to begin with, ask the people, what should they have? What permission should that position have, regardless of who takes it on? Which then allows you, through attrition process of migration of people moving in and out of the positions, how they change, it gives you this whole visibility. So we started down that path very early, and we're able to put that all together through, like I said, through an orchestration platform, changing the way we looked at data, and then we looked at tools that could support that process. So today we have the ability to automate the front end, automate orchestration, automate that delivery mechanism, as well as validate it, check it on the back end from a compliance perspective, from a security perspective, understanding that across the entire platform. Is it 100% today? No, I can't claim that it is. I wish, but unfortunately businesses change, tools change, companies come in, they go out, business wants to do different things, so we're in a constant motion of bringing that in. But having that centralized place to be able to see identity, who has access, clarify it as to how they got it, where it went, and understand that in the process became this immensely powerful tool. So yesterday I heard this term and I loved it, and I'm going to start using it, that identity is the new perimeter. So since everybody wants to say there is no perimeter anymore, now, no, identity's the new perimeter, and I absolutely agree with that. Because we think about how data proliferation has gone on, where our data is, you don't have control of the infrastructure anymore, you don't really have control of who can see that data. From an administrative standpoint, you may not have logs, you may not have the ability to protect it in a native form. Identity becomes that critical control, and I absolutely agree with that identity is the perimeter spot that we have the manageability from a security perspective. So that's kind of been where we are, and I'm more interested. Do you have questions? Because that's the biggest thing I can help. And we have a limited set of time in 2 minutes, so fast questions, fast answers, but I'd love to know what we can answer, and I'm happy to stick around a little bit and do that more personally too. So, questions? Anybody? Yes, sir.
So, when you made the matrix for the positions of jobs and responsibilities, sometimes a person can work at multiple positions, and there can be conflicts.
Yes. So when we built the matrix, we ran into that exactly. And if you didn't hear, the question was, people have multiple roles, so they might be in a single position, but they can handle multiple roles. So when we built the matrix, we built it as an understanding of what the maximum capability that a person might have. So it is okay within our matrix process for a single position to be indicated into 2, 3, 4 roles. But if you try to give them the 5th that they're not authorized for, the system will actually reject it automatically. So by understanding that, though, right, you get into those scenarios where I have 3 accounting clerks that all have different permissions. And as the identity person, you're looking at it going, that doesn't make any sense. Why? But to the business, it makes perfect sense. So you've got 1 or 2 choices. You can either do that, is to allow for that, or you go to your HR and say, okay, I need to have 3 clerk positions so that I can manage this better, and that becomes unmanageable in and of itself, because then HR starts to complain that they're having transfers too often, and then they yell. So, but yes, that is.
Do you have capabilities to also handle separation of duties with that? When
we do.
Role 2 and role 4 are not compatible together.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. That's one of the brilliant things. Thanks you for asking. Is that as you get that visibility, as you begin to see that in the back end, you have separated systems, and the easiest one is always your accounting system and your purchasing system may not be the same thing. But what about those people who can issue a purchase order and the people who can pay a purchase order? They should never be the same person, and yet they're 2 disparate systems, and they can be very quickly invisible, especially when you have a hidden set of roles or a hidden set of permissions. having that tool set that can reach in, grab all that data, unify it, and present it is incredibly valuable to find those segregation of duties.
Yes.
Anything else? Oh, in the back.
I was going to ask, what tools or processes you're doing this discovery of all identities and permissions you use to create digital graphs? A lot of manual work and trying to put together everyone's access and group membership, or was there a tool that integrated everything and set that out in a nice slide?
I'll let him answer the magic tool side because he works for the vendor, so I don't want to be the one to say it. But
Yes, that was exactly the question, the leading question we wanted you to answer, because I know, although I'm not supposed to talk about solutions here, but if you look into Veza, this is exactly what we do, and David is one of our early customers, and we go on the road
and
quite a bit.
technology challengers.
Yes, that's right, and it has pushed us forward to answer that question of really building that graph together and then capabilities on top of all that information together.
To your point, yes, it's a constant understanding. But once you understand the frame to get it into the system, that unified frame, then it's a matter of how do you get it out of the application that you're looking at, whether that's a database, whether it has to be an online report that you parse, whatever. There's 100 different ways that you need to bring the data out because unfortunately the application developers don't create this lovely unified platform to give it to you. So that's the front end development side, but once you've got that rolling, it becomes pretty straightforward and repeatable. It becomes a very repeatable process. Yes?
How have your audit findings changed?
Well, I will tell you that the matrix process, building all of this over the last 3 years, I hate to admit it, I went into an audit committee meeting about 6 years ago, and the number was north of 1,000 findings, which was not pleasant. Luckily, I can still sit down. I was debatable after that. But in the last 6 years building this, making this a priority and doing this, last year I had one. Literally just one finding. And that was a human error mistake, which I've now automated that to the humans not even needed anymore. But don't, we moved them to a new job. We didn't get rid of them. So, yes, sir.
Yeah.
So how long did it take you to find that 1,000 versus the one?
Well, like I said, it took a process. We had to really rethink the way we were doing things. Probably in the first year, I only reduced it by about maybe 10 or 20. The second year of doing the work and really digging in and making it happen, that was the biggest reduction. So we probably pulled 90% in that second year because we had a unified process. We now understood how to collect the data, what we were trying to report on, and what we were trying to do. And then it was just growing out the application base after that. So I'm not suggesting it's a snap your fingers and it happens. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of work, but it is possible to get to exactly what we talked about, to get to least privilege. The other thing we're actually looking at right now is not just least privilege, but least privilege just in time. So understanding through process automation, you have a month-end process that you need a set of permissions for 1 day a month. So being able to take them away the other 29, 30 days a month and only give it to you when you need it. Or tie into our HR platform when you go on vacation, reduce your elevated privilege literally automatically as your vacation's approved. And somebody said, well, what if I get called on an emergency on vacation? I'm like, company says you're supposed to take the time off. We'll deal with that as a one-off as opposed to the norm. So let's reduce that permission set, which reduces risk, increases security posture, right? So those are new thoughts, and it's interesting to be able to sit in that role now and go, how can we do this even more effectively?
Yeah, I think we have time for probably one more question.
One more.
So,
How are you managing your exceptions?
Carefully. No. Exception processing is always the hardest part. So the matrix process, we built that in. If it's unapproved, we have a whole workflow process to allow it to go back to the business owner and get an exception approval. Again, the matrix is designed to be the maximum allowed, not just that narrow band focus. So that exception, in a sense, is just a second parameter that's allowed.
All right, I think we're about out of time here, but I really appreciate everyone coming, and I hope you have a little bit more of a, maybe optimism about getting the least privilege than when you did when you came. But thanks for your time. Please come up, ask us later. Thank you.